Right, so Labour Friends of Israel, even once they are outside of the Labour Party and no longer therefore part of LFI, the bending over for the apartheid state of Israel continues, it seems. Though when Sunak's Tories and Starmer's Labour seem to be in competition with each other in the sycophancy stakes in that regard, it is a bit of an Animal Farm situation where you're basically looking from man to pig and pig to man and cannot tell the difference anymore, isn't it? Red Tories within the Labour ranks are nothing new though, be they current ones or previous ones. They certainly are far more authoritarian now and throwing their weight around a lot more, but they've always been there. And one example of a yesterday's man who fits into that description is former Labour MP turned crossbench peer, having been put into the House of Lords by the Tories, so underlining that man-to-pig example all the more, John Woodcock, now posturing as Lord Walney. And indeed, this is how he gets presented in the press, of course. But not only did he accept a peerage from the Tories despite supposedly being a Labour man, he is now the Tory government's advisor on political violence. And in that remit, he's been producing a report which has been subject to being leaked, a little bit at any rate, with plans to ban so-called extremist protest groups. Well, where does the line get drawn on that, then, I wonder? And who draws it? And given that Walney is a former chair of LFI, no less, and one of the groups he's pointing at is Palestine Action, is this not blatant bias and abuse of our human rights, not to mention an act of political violence, perhaps, in and of itself? Right, so, political violence, what is that when it's at home, you might be wondering? Well, it might make you think of those two MPs who were murdered in recent years, of course, Joe Cox and David Amos. Perhaps that's where your mind rightfully goes to start with. Perhaps you might be thinking instead of protesters rocking up outside Keir Starmer's house and giving him a headache right on his doorstep. My goodness, didn't the media slam them for that? And I don't disagree, actually. I don't think people should camp out and intimidate people, even politicians, on their doorsteps. But where was the mainstream media when this was happening to Jeremy Corbyn then? Well, they were joining in then, weren't they? One rule for the pro-establishment and another for everyone else. Political violence itself, though, is defined in British law, and it works both ways. It can be committed against governments or by them, and includes already things such as torture, ethnic cleansing, genocide, police brutality, assassination, terrorist attacks, guerrilla warfare, and can also include rioting, kidnapping, treason, or even an attempted coup. Protest, you will note, is not there. But you can look at that list and look at Israel and think, well, there's a good example of political violence being carried out against occupied people, in which case. But it isn't them that Lord Walney is interested in, and as a former chair of Labour Friends of Israel, I can't imagine why he would cast a blind eye at that. But you can absolutely surmise it might be behind his decision, according to leaked documentation, to accuse those protesting against Israel right now as the extremist protesters. Yes, he apparently wants to bring in a whole new category of protest called extreme protest. And two groups, Palestine Action and Just Stop Oil, are in his sights, and he's advocating for them to be proscribed and restricted in what they can and cannot do. And should he get his way, should the Tories take advice and make it law, sanctions could include preventing them from assembling and meeting and also fundraising. Here's an excerpt on what's been said. Militant groups like Palestine Action and Just Stop Oil are using criminal tactics to create mayhem and hold the public and workers to ransom without fear of consequence, Lord Walney said. Banning terror groups has made it harder for their activists to plan crimes. That approach should be extended to extreme protest groups too. Just Stop Oil said the government were the dangerous radicals that are endangering all of us through their climate policies. Palestine Action claimed its actions were in line with the most of the British public who want an arms embargo between the UK and Israel, and the proposals would not deter their campaign. The new restriction orders would be distinct from proscription on terrorism grounds, the report will say, but the mechanism could limit the activities of organisations that have a policy of using criminal offences or causing serious disruption to influence government or public debate. If a group's actions were persistent and used to promote a political or ideological cause, that would count against them, according to the recommendation. It will come as part of a review into tackling political violence by Lord Walney, the former Labour MP John Woodcock, which was commissioned 3 years ago, but is yet to be published. Right, so their criminal tactics mean they are being accused of political violence then, does it? But there's no violence here, is there? Just Stop Oil will sit in the middle of the road. They will slow walk. They will graffiti. They might throw soup at some paintings. They're very fond of throwing orange paint around as well. But it all washes off, doesn't it? Protest is supposed to be disruptive. It happens when people with strong feelings aren't getting listened to and feel the need to escalate matters. You can certainly argue that some of what they have done perhaps crosses the line of criminality. However, the right to protest does not preclude that. You might not like it, but if you aren't listening, all they can do is escalate. At no point have they or Palestine Action acted in any violent manner towards anyone. However, certainly the police have to them. We have seen police brutality at protests, and that does come under political violence. How come I seem to know more about this brief than you do, Woodcock? It's a fine line, a small step between labelling these people, these groups, as extreme protesters now, to labelling them as something more like terrorists later on, and you can be sure the mainstream media will hurry that up, and before long you end up in a situation where protesters are labelled as such. Just like, for example, anti-Zionists being labelled as anti-Semites when the two are not mutually exclusive. That one beginning to unravel again now, but it has certainly been muddled for a long, long time. Indeed, Walney himself gave the game away there in a quote from that piece published by the BBC when he said, "Banning terror groups has made it harder for their activists to plan crimes. That approach should be extended to extreme protest groups too." This is intentional language that conflates the word activist with the word terrorist, and it needs spotting and calling out wherever it is seen. And I'd remind you, this guy used to be a Labour MP, yet is acting like the most right-wing of Tories. No wonder Natalie Elphicke feels quite at home in Labour these days, does it? To weaken the right to protest is to weaken our freedom of speech and expression. And of course these are protected under the European Convention of Human Rights, which Rishi Sunak keeps threatening to take us out of anyway, making us as big a global pariah as the likes of Russia and Belarus. So this would just be another reason to try and do so, wouldn't it? As no doubt these moves against these protest groups would certainly result in legal action, which the government wouldn't have a leg to stand on over. There is no violence here. But moving the goalposts of the law, frankly, this is all Sunak's Tories have ever seemed to do for years now to get their own way, is what this is all about. Move the goalposts, change the rules of the law slightly, change the remit of the law, as it were. But it doesn't actually, all it does is clamp down on protest, and you can't clamp down on protest when everybody has a right to do that. Starmer is apparently supportive of all this as well. Of course, he's certainly the same faction as Woodcock was, even if he lied about it to get where he is today. And who can forget him saying in regards to Just Stop Oil, "Get up, go home, I'm opposed to what you're doing." What, protesting for change? The very thing the Labour Party was built on? You do surprise me, Keith. Both Starmer and Woodcock are avowedly pro-Israel, so targeting Palestine Action can be seen as nothing short of a cynical ploy in line with their biases. Israel is a genocidal state meting out political violence. Yet protesting that is what will instead get recognised as political violence in this country if Woodcock gets his way and his report, when finally published, gets enacted on and law is changed as a consequence, and not for the better, because that is basically a given at this point, isn't it? A genocidal apartheid state and the Tory government's main political violence advisor will in all likelihood advocate to see protesting that labelled political violence instead. It's all just one more reason why, on top of electoral reform, Lord's reform come hotly after. Indeed, Labour's position on protest was underlined in no uncertain terms not all that long ago when Palestine protesters hit a Labour Party fundraiser being hosted by Angela Rayner. And if you still think she's somehow one of the good ones in the Labour Party, then please watch this video recommendation next and see if you still think that, going by her reaction, or lack of one. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.